Welcome to the 2021 Nautilus Book Awards Author Spotlight Series. I'm your host, Christine Upchurch. Now celebrating 21 years of honoring better books for a better world, Nautilus Book Awards continues to embrace books from a wide spectrum in the publishing industry. Books which radiate hope and wisdom. Books which nurture our interconnection and connect us together as individuals, as communities, and as planetary citizens. This is a vast conversation, one which is particularly crucial now more than ever before. Today, we are focusing our spotlight on author Dr. Philip Loring. He's won a Silver Award in the category for Ecology and Environment for his book, Finding Our Niche Toward a Restorative Human Ecology. Dr. Philip Loring is a widely respected anthropologist, a writer, an ecologist. His focus is on the intersection of sustainability, food, and social justice. His research has taken him all over the world, and he has written many, many articles, including 50 academic publications. He's also had a TEDx talk focusing on heroes that has been viewed more than 100,000 times. Finding Our Niche is his first book. And in fact, he's not only won the Silver Award for the Nautilus Book Awards, but also a Gold Medal Award for the Independent Publisher Awards in the regional nonfiction category. I'd like to welcome our guest today, Dr. Philip Loring, and congratulations, Philip, for a wonderful book and for the awards that it's getting.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me here today.
You know, Philip, I'm always curious about what inspires somebody to write a book. Clearly, you are already great at communicating through the written word with all your publications, as well as the essays that you've written. But you wrote this book. What inspired you to write it?
The ideas you see in Finding Our Niche were circling me for a number of years. And I kept sitting down to think, I want to be able to share some of these great stories I'm seeing, share stories about the win-win scenarios that people are achieving in their food systems, which is what the book is largely about. But every time I sat down to write the book, I sort of hit a wall, and I realized I needed more, and I needed to experience more. But I knew, the written word is such a compelling way, and story is such a powerful way to get people to understand themselves, help them think about their relationship to the natural world. And at its heart, if it's anything, the sustainability challenges we face are at their heart challenges related to story and the roles we see for ourselves, the way we relate to the natural world. And so while I could write an essay here or an essay there and some academic articles that circled some specific issues related to sustainable food systems, they wouldn't connect in the same way, I didn't think, with in the audience I wanted to reach, which is, a very wide audience of general readers, to help them understand and maybe see themselves and their role in environmental solutions a little bit more differently.
I'm also curious about why you chose the word niche.
Sure. So as you said, I'm an anthropologist and I'm also trained in ecology, and niche is one of the most fundamental concepts in ecology for understanding species behavior and species interaction. And when I was a graduate student and I was taking these ecology classes, community ecology in particular, I remember learning about all these different beautiful relationships between different species, between fig wasps and figs, between beavers and the associated, and their dams, and all of the biodiversity and the landscape that those create. And I remember thinking, why is it that every other species in the world can have their own niche, their niche where they live the way that they live, and those impacts are beneficial to the rest of the ecosystem around them? Why is it there are so many different beautiful ways of coexisting among other species, but not for people? And that was the problem that I kept trying to dig into in my research over the years, was to understand, what is our niche? We have a real challenge in environmental thinking, I think, that we're always sort of blaming ourselves and thinking that we're destined to do wrong. We're destined that all of our actions are going to have a negative impact, that if we're going to do well, that if we're going to be affluent and well and healthy, that's going to hurt the environment. You know, growing food is bad for the environment, for example. But the concept of niche says there's a place for us. And so the question then, the quest really in writing the book became, what is our niche? Can we find it?
I love that, Philip. It's interesting, throughout your book, you take some of the concepts that are quite prevalent associated with conservation, sustainability, ecology, and you look at it from some different angles and offer a new perspective, not just philosophically, but with really well-documented examples. One simple example of that is what you talked about relating to cities. There are people out there right now who say that we should really concentrate humanity into cities and let nature, exist in the rest of the world. What's your perspective on that?
Well, the way we think about cities and their ecology and the role of wild creatures and wilderness in cities has changed a lot over the years. And I think what you're getting at is there's this concept, this long-standing concept in conservation that's known as fortress conservation, where we get ourselves all together and we build up walls around ourselves to separate ourselves from the rest of the natural world. And first off, we've tried it. It's not working. In fact, it has generally devastating consequences, both when we sort of take people off of the land, often indigenous people, forced relocations and such, whose lifestyles and livelihoods and lifeways were integral to that landscape. They were a part of that landscape, just like a beaver on the landscape, just like any other species. They had a niche that they filled, and that niche was good for them, and that niche was good for the rest of the land. And, cities are a really interesting challenge because we are not the only species to ever try to develop very dense styles of living, in dense communities or colonies. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in cities, but there's also a lot of challenges in cities because we've built up those walls and we've tried to keep the rest of the wild world out of it. But when we actually can benefit from letting a little bit in, letting the raptors in, the pigeons are such an important part of urban ecology. The upside of cities is that they can be really efficient. You don't need to drive if you've got really good transit. So there's a lot of benefits. The challenge is, I think, whether or not when we build our cities and plan them and think about what it's like to live in them, whether or not we feel like we're walling ourselves off or we are opening ourselves up to the landscape and the seascapes that we are on or adjacent to.
Mm-hmm. And throughout this book, you talk about the importance of our relationship to nature. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering if you would share just a little bit of your book, if you'd read us a passage from your book.
Yeah, sure, I will. Let's see here. I will read the start of chapter 4. Now, this relates to your question about cities, because the title of the chapter is Engineers. It was past midnight, perhaps closer to 1 a.m. in December of 2015. I was in a place called Fulford Harbor in British Columbia's Gulf Islands region. The harbor is on the south end of Salt Spring Island, not far from Vancouver. The many provincial ferries that connect the scattering of communities of the Strait of Georgia and Puget Sound were no longer running. The water of the harbor was oil black, lit only by a fingernail of a moon and the infrequent pass of headlights from the cars on the bluff above. It was quiet and the whole world seemed to be asleep. Yet there was a flurry of activity on a small stretch of the southwest beach of the harbor. A driftwood campfire burned, casting dim light on a group of people. They were digging hurriedly in the rocky beach with the shovels and garden forks, while a solitary heron kept watch, standing aloof in the obsidian water just inshore from a long, ancient rock wall. The still of this night was interrupted only by sounds of laughter, of metal striking rock, and, if you listened hard enough, of the water lapping the hull of a Parks Canada vessel anchored not too far from the heron. From that boat, if anyone were aboard, the pinpricks of light from the people's headlamps and flashlights would appear as lightning bugs, bouncing to and fro across the beach. To passerbys, it might have seemed like some sort of covert treasure hunt was taking place. But these people were not treasure hunters. Rather, they're clam gardeners, working quickly because the window for the low tide is short, and there are only a handful of tides each year low enough to allow this kind of work. I was with them to help, to observe, and to document, and in less than an hour, the water began to return, covering the walk wall and seeping back into the many divots that the gardeners had made with their shovels and the boots as they dug for clams and moved perhaps a few hundred small rocks back to the ancient rock wall that stands at the low tide line. That wall had stood there for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. It was built by the ancestors of these very diggers. The tides have disassembled it, rock by rock, wave by wave, over the many decades since these beaches were last tended.
Beautiful. I can imagine it very clearly. Throughout your book, you talk a lot about your relationship with Chief Patrick Smith.
Yeah.
Why is he such an integral part of your story, your journey, and your perspective on, the sustainability?
Well, earlier in our conversation, I mentioned that I had a hard time for a long time writing this book. And part of the barrier was that I realized that this wasn't just a story about the environment. This was also a story about me and my experience coming to terms with being a settler and coming to terms with settler colonialism and its impacts and legacies. And I think this process of reconnecting with nature, reconciling our relationship with it also is, it's not just an ecological problem, but it's a personal journey as well. And at the center of my journey on both of those accounts about thinking about sustainability, but also sort of coming to terms with who I am in this, my purpose for and desire to help solve these problems, really all rested in my relationship with Patrick. Patrick Smith was the chief of a small community called Minto. One of the few sort of rural remote communities that is on the road system in Alaska. And he and I, over the years that I worked before he passed away from cancer, he and I spent a lot of time on the land and talking about a number of different things. And some of it was, sometimes we were talking about moose hunting and climate change. Other times we were talking about grief and healing. And, Patrick was very, he caught on very early that there were a lot of things that I was still sort of trying to understand and recover from when I lost my own father. And so a lot of our conversations really mingled between personal healing and the environment and what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a part of a community. Once I realized I had to bring those stories into this book, that journey I went on with Patrick and my relationship with him, that was when sort of everything clicked. And then I was just able to sit down and write the book.
Wonderful. So you talk a little bit, you spoke a little bit just now about social justice and how those of us who are of European heritage have to come to terms with the role that our ancestors have played and with the role that civilization is playing. How do you kind of merge the social justice, the sustainability, and the balance and relationship that we have with our planet?
That is a win-win. One of the things that I often heard said by Patrick and others in one way or another on the work that I talk about in this book is that truth is justice. And when we speak truth to our histories, to our past, to the challenges we currently face, to the inequities inherent in those challenges, that's the first step to justice. And, it's become sort of sustainability has become such a scientific puzzle for so many people that it's almost become reduced to this question of numbers, how much can we take so that it's there again next year? But whenever we laser and focus on just that aspect of our relationships with the natural world, it doesn't end up being durable. Other challenges arise. And so without addressing the justice components, making sure that people have access to resources, making sure that past environmental and social harms are addressed, without that, sustainability really is a vacuous term. But when you bring justice into it, now you're speaking more truthfully about what it takes to have generative, positive human environment relationships and thus human relationships.
So Philip, I know that there are some people who think that humans are like a cancer on the earth. Mm. Do you envision that there are ways in which we humans can be an integral part of a healthy, enlivened planet?
I do. And that's what Finding Our Niche is about at its core. It's that we have humanity for hundreds of thousands of years coexisted in healthful and reciprocal ways with the rest of the natural world. And yes, we've been capable of some really horrible things and some really bad environmental missteps, but it's just a fraction of our history. And if you look at humanity as a whole, you see the potential, you see the lived experience in our history that shows we can coexist. We can have positive relationships, achieve win-win scenarios where people and nature thrive together. And I try to tell some of those stories in the book. But it starts with addressing this myth we have that we're broken, that we're unsustainable, that by nature, life is, we're greedy and life is short, and realizing there's another story for humanity, a story that many Indigenous communities still walk and understand and embody.
Mm. Why is it you think that metaphors are so important in communicating some of these environmental issues?
Well, many environmental issues are hard to pin down. They don't happen in your backyard, or sometimes they're incremental, and the change happens over such a long period of time that people's baselines shift. And so it can be really hard for people to relate to environmental problems and then to understand their role in them and help people understand their role in them without paralyzing them by guilt or paralyzing them by the size of the problem. And so what metaphors do, I think, is they give you a little bit of scaffolding to figure out how to think about the issue. One of the metaphors that I lead to in the book is walking like a river. I'm sort of riffing on Aldo Leopold's famous Thinking Like a Mountain, where, I encourage people to think about our lives as an interplay with the rest of the natural world, a give and take, much the way that the water and the banks of the water have an interplay. If every river in the world was straight, all that water would run right out to the sea right away, and there'd be no, it wouldn't be generating all the life it does when you get a river's meander. The whole ecosystem holds so much more water and therefore so much more life by all the niches created by this give and take, this interplay of the water and the banks of the river. And that's a metaphor that I think that we can draw on. That gives us a bit of an understanding that our lives, the way we, instead of thinking about just reducing our impact, think about our impacts as this give and take, this relationship where the mutual outcomes are what we're going for.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. In your book, you talk about post-heroic leadership. Can you share with our viewers what you mean by that?
Sure. And incidentally, that's also an idea that I explored in the TED Talk that you mentioned. And it's one of the many lessons that I learned from working with Patrick. When I started my journey going back to graduate school, I wanted to save the world. I had this very Captain Kirk inspired, the great white man theory of history, right? There's always the one person, the great lone leader who goes into the belly of the cave, changes, comes out, transforms, and solves people's problems for them. And that's the hero. That's the hero leadership model. And when you really look at how change happens and great movements and great achievements in society and in history, what you see is it's never really just that one person. It's people, it's collaboratives and collectives, and that coalesce around a vision for change. And so the post-heroic leadership is very much sort of an anti-colonial leadership. We don't need to wait for somebody who's specially endowed with certain kinds of technological skills or science or money or an idea. We can solve problems together if we will work at them collectively.
I love that. Philip, congratulations on a beautiful, profoundly inspirational book. And on your Silver Award. And again, your book is entitled Finding Our Niche Toward a Restorative Human Ecology. Congratulations and thank you again, Philip.
Thanks so much. Thank you.